There's been a recent news item that's a little bit interesting, which has to do with Sheikhs in Hebron who are trying to offer supposedly some kind of separate peace with the state of Israel that extracts them from under the thumb of the so-called Palestinian Authority and allows them to make their own peace agreement with the Jewish state. There's a separate question of how truly feasible or genuine this offer, this scenario really is. But I think even if in this particular version it doesn't come to pass, it's an interesting one to think about through the lens of Torah and to ask how maybe the Torah guides us towards possibilities that kind of look like this. So I want to start in what may seem like a strange place at first, which is in the life of Avraham Avinu, a famous episode, The War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings, which begins, Wahi b'yamei Amrael melech Shinar, Arioch melech Elasar, Kedol Omer melech Einam, Tidal melech Goyim. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedol Omer, king of Aram, and Tidal, king of nations. That's the first verse. And we don't need to go through the whole story and what happens with Stom and with Lot and Aram and everything else. But the very compressed version is that these four kings come and sack Stom. Avram has to rescue Lot. And he enlists his friends Mamre and Aner to join him, and they make a little band and they go off and they fight off a much bigger army, and they win. And we can get into a little more detail with that. But first, I want to just ask, who are these kings? And I want to give a sort of ahistorical and possibly more prophetic reading of who these kings are. I say ahistorical because one of the kings listed here, Kedula Omer, is said to be the king of Elam. And Elam as a nation, although it's listed as a nation mentioned in the Toldot, in the generations of Shem, when you look through the rest of Tanakh, Elam seems to be Persia, somewhere in Persia, like Shushan. You see that in Yirmiyahu, where Elam is referred to along with Madai, the Medians, whereas later in Megillat Esther, it's Parsu Madai, Persia and the Medians. You see it in Daniel, and various other places as well, where someone is in some kind of fortress of Elam, and it specifies that that's some capital in Persia. And so, of course, it could be the case that the Elam being referred to at this point, 4,000 years ago, before Persia became a major power, and before Persia would have been mucking around in Eretz Canaan, could just be referring to a different nation that happens to have that name. But I think you either have to say instead that Elam always refers to Persia, and that the Torah is prophetically referring to Persia here in the in the book of Genesis, in Sefer Bereshit, or you can say that, let's say, the prophetic insight of, or the Ruach Kodesh, the spirit of inspiration of the authors of other books of Tanakh that came later, were connecting the idea of Elam back to this moment in order to make a point. So let's run with that point for the moment and say that Kedor Omer represents Persia, even if it's kind of hard to square that with what we might think of historically speaking during this period. So what would it mean that Elam is Persia here? Well, who are the other kings? So there's Amraphel melech Shinar. Shinar is the easiest thing because Shinar is mentioned, for example, in the story of Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. And so we know that Shinar was basically Babylonia, or at least Mesopotamia. And really, the first mention of Shinar is one that kind of conflates Bavel and Assyria as being one Mesopotamian conglomerate which geographically in modern Iraq makes some amount of sense, that you have Babylonia that maybe originates a bit further south in Iraq, but then, Assyria's capital was Nineveh, which is in northern Iraq or eastern Syria. So what tehi reshit mamlachto Bavel u'erech u'akad u'chalne beretz Shinar. And this is talking about Nimrod, this great mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Bavel and Erech and Akkad and Chalne in the land of Shinar. Mina haaretz ahi yatsa Ashur, ve'hiven et Nineveh, ve'et Rehovot Ir, ve'et Kalach. So out of that land went forth Assyria, which built Nineveh and built the city of Rehovot and Kalach. So it's conflating Bavel and Assyria as kind of one geographic region that gave rise to two different empires. And that actually suits us well, because when we go back to Amraphel Melech Shinar, and we say, okay, let's say Amraphel Melech Shinar is provisionally Bavel, because Bavel is very strongly associated with Shinar. Then who is Arioch Melech Elasar? So Arioch does elsewhere in Tanakh connect us back to that same region of, let's say, Bavel or Bavel plus Assyria, like Mesopotamia, because Arioch, for example, is mentioned in Sefer Daniel as the name of some king's captain when he's in Babylon, right? So Arioch connects in that way to that region, but also in what we just read, there was this list of different nations or different cities or what have you, right? Where it was Reshit Mamlachto. It was talking about the beginning of the kingdom of Kedor Laomer, Reshit Mamlachto, Bavel ve'erech ve'akad ve'chalne. So it's Babylonia and Erech and Akkad. And so I'm going to notice Erech there and say that that's pretty similar to Arioch. And so we have, pleasingly, two different kings who are from Mesopotamia. One maybe more strongly associated with Babylonia, the other one that appears within a few words of mention of Assyria in the Torah. And so if we're allowing a bit of blurriness or delocalization of the identity a little bit, then we can say between Amraphel Melech Shinar and Arioch Melech Elasar, we can attach those two kings to Bavel and Assyria. Now, why is that interesting? Well, because we have now Persia, Bavel, and Assyria, and that starts to really sound like a who's who kind of list of the great powers that conquered Eretz Israel during the Age of Empires, right? The Assyrians carried off the northern kingdom, then the Babylonians sacked Yerushalayim, destroyed the temple. And then the Persians came and they conquered the Babylonians, and they ruled over Eretz Israel for a while. And if we go all the way to that point, what's interesting is that you could say, okay, so we're reading this ahistorically, we're reading it kind of prophetically and saying this is the Torah talking with some kind of high altitude view of the whole history of the land of Israel. And it's listing the major players, right? Who's the last player? The last player has to be Greco-Roman civilization, right? You could say the Greeks or Hellenistic civilization, but the Romans adopted the gods of the Greeks and were in many ways therefore a continuation of the Greeks. And so we should, in any case, say that the remaining component of this list, if that's the theory of the case, should be Greco-Roman or Hellenistic, or however you want to put it. And that's Tidal Melech Goyim. So that sounds very blank, right? I can't make much out of the name Tidal, but Goyim is just nations. So what does nations have to do with Hellenism? Well, interestingly, the first use of that word in the Torah, nations, is when talking about the Toldot, the generations that came out of Yafet after the flood. Yafet, the son of Noach. It says, Ufnei Yawan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kitim, Dodanim, Me'ele nifredu Iye HaGoyim Ba'arotzotam, Ish Lilshono Mishpachotam Begoyehem. Okay, so the sons of Yawan, or Greece, are Elisha, Tarshish, Kitim, and Dodanim. By these were the islands of the nations, the Goyim, divided in their lands, every one of them after their tongue, after their families and their nations. So the word Goyim actually has good branding for Hellenism because its first use in the Torah is specifically referring to all of these island peoples to the west of Eretz Yisrael in the Mediterranean, these seafaring peoples that certainly include the Greeks since they're explicitly mentioned here. And so that starts to be a pretty neat collection of items that we have, right? We have Assyria, Babylonia, we have Persia, we have Greece, or Greece and Rome, if we want to say there's one Greco-Roman civilization. And especially in that latter approach, we get to carry things all the way from before the destruction of the first temple, from the sacking of the northern kingdom, all the way up through the destruction of the second temple by the Romans, right? And that is the age of empires in Eretz Yisrael from start to finish. So that is quite interesting, because now what that's saying is, don't look at this war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings just as this strange event that happened 4,000 years ago in the life of Avraham, that it's very hard to find any archaeological parallel to, and we're trying to sort of sort out what event is the Torah talking about, or why does it particularly matter that these particular kings were the ones who came and attacked Eretz Canaan. What if instead the names are being chosen in order to give us a kind of parable about the whole experience of the Jewish people trying to have sovereignty in their land, right? That Avram is going to be given this land, Eretz Canaan, by Hashem, and he's experiencing what it's like now to be this tiny fledgling power in this little land, while there are these much bigger kings and emperors warring over the land or through the land, because it's at the crossroads of 3 continents. And that's especially easy to appreciate if you have a little bit of history from antiquity and you actually identify with all these kings, with all these different chapters in that history that spans centuries, because then you really appreciate exactly this point, that Eretz Yisrael is exactly at the crossroads of the 3 continents where human civilization first sprang up. And it was therefore always vulnerable to attack from any direction, and likely to be attacked by powers that had access to much bigger economies, to much bigger militaries, and to much greater technology, etc. And there was a lot of reason to think, even to the degree that there still is now, how much more so would it have been the case then. There was always ample reason to think there's no way that you can have an independent kingdom here in this tiny little patch of territory, because it's just a footnote for some other empire to come along and swallow it up, as they indeed did, right? And so it's complicated, because the lesson of Tanakh is not, no, Hashem wants the Jewish people to have a little nation state here, and so Hashem will always protect you. You can't be conquered. It seems like it's against the laws of social and military and economic physics or something, but it actually isn't, because Hashem always, shelters you in his hand. He doesn't, in fact, because sometimes he lets them conquer you because you're doing idolatry, you're turning away from Hashem. If you abandon Hashem, then he abandons you. That's the lesson of many books in Tanakh. So the northern kingdom decides to go and become committed to worship of Baal Peor instead of, or the Baal, Baal Zevuv, whatever, all the different Baals. So they're worshiping Baal in the northern kingdom, and they get swallowed up by Assyria. And then there are wicked kings like Menashe, who are idolaters and murderers, who are ruling the southern kingdom, the Judaic kingdom. And so eventually they're sacked and destroyed by the Babylonians. And then they go into exile. They come back because the Persians conquered the land, and the Persians at times are also kind of their enemy, maybe because they're not going back to the land. Maybe they're hanging out in Shushan, like in Gilat Esther, and they should be going back to the land, but they're not, so they have trouble there. Or maybe it's also because the people don't go enough back to the land that they sort of miss their opportunity, and it becomes hard to go back to the land because people didn't just listen to Koresh and go back, and it's harder under other kings, etc. And then you come up to the Greek period, and again, eventually the Maccabees are having to fight, and then eventually the Romans are going to destroy the temple because of all the different ways in which things became corrupt and the people turned away from Hashem. So there's this ability, if you want, to look at the history of Eretz Israel and say it's just normal history of antiquity. It does make sense that this little patch of land is just going to get steamrolled by one ancient empire after another. But the truth is that when you look at things through the lens of what the Hebrew prophets are writing, there is a different explanatory theory that says, no, actually, there is a way of holding on to this land, but the way of holding on to this land is to cleave to Hashem and his Torah, and to do so with trust that this is the way, but not really understanding how it could possibly work. And then you're successful, like Chizkiyahu, who prevented the Assyrians from sacking Jerusalem, even though he didn't really have more than his rejection of their idolatry and his faith in Hashem to protect himself. Or you do have the Maccabees, who were able to throw out this giant Hellenistic empire that was ruling over them because of their commitment to rededicating the temple. And so there is a way of holding onto the land, but you clearly also are going to get steamrolled sometimes, especially when you're rejecting Hashem and turning away from him, because then he'll turn away from you. So that's what you can get from the rest of Tanakh. That's what you can get from taking a broad view of Jewish history in the land of Israel. The question is, what is the Torah talking about specifically here with Avram? And what's the additional point? And there, I think the interesting thing to look at is Aner and Mamre. So who are Aner and Mamre? Well, we said that these are friends of Avram's who help him to rescue Lot after Sodom and all the people of Sodom, including Lot, are taken captive by Amraphel and Kedorlaomer and all of them. V'yavo hapalit v'yaged leAvram ha'ivri v'hu shochen belonei Mamre ha'emori ahi eshkol wa'ahi Aner v'hem ba'alei brit Avram. Okay, so we're in Elonei Mamre, which is around Hebron, by the way. So elsewhere, we hear that because, for example, when Avram purchases Merat HaMachpelah, when the cave where he's going to bury Sarah, we have psukim like "V'achari chen kavar Avraham et Sarah ishto el mi'arat sedeh HaMachpelah al pnei Mamre hi Hebron be'eretz Canaan." Okay, so after this, Avram buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of the Machpelah. Before Mamre, the same is Hebron in the land of Canaan. So Elonei Mamre is Hebron, but Mamre is also a person. He's this friend of Avram's, this Emori, in the time that he's there in Canaan. There's a specific statement elsewhere in Brit Bein HaBetarim that one of the reasons that Hashem is not just giving Canaan to Avram right now is because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. Or is not yet complete, meaning that the Amorites are maybe kind of good people at that time, good enough that Hashem is not going to just destroy their civilization and throw them out of their land. And that's reflected also by the fact that Avram is able to befriend an Emori at that time and in that generation. Okay, so there's Aner and Mamre and Eshkol, and they're these friends of Avram, or maybe let's say, is it just Aner and Mamre? And we're just mentioning for some reason that Mamre is the brother of Eshkol. Um, let's see. Mamre ha'emori ahi eshkol ahi Aner. Okay, so maybe it's um, these are different confederates of Aram who are brothers. Um, but so what's the point we want to make here? Well, Aner and Mamre um, are, and you could say also Eshkol. Um, Aner and Mamre uh, are these locals who are friends of Avram. And Avram is dealing with the problem of how, in a sense, to maintain a kind of responsibility for the land and sovereignty in the land when there are these greater powers surrounding it who are sort of clashing and invading and trying to exert imperial influence. And I think what's interesting about this is it's just a simple point. And you could say it may be a coincidence, but it brings us to the present day that these are friends who are from around Hebron. And that is that there are always going to be locals in the land who are not necessarily part of Am Yisrael. And in the present day, it is very tempting to view the current situation as one where, because locals by and large declare war on us and say they want no part in sharing this land with us and want to throw us out, that we have to respond accordingly and in kind, right? And so it's obviously the case that sometimes you can view your sort of locals who are opposing Judaic sovereignty in the land of Israel as an enemy. That ends up often being the case. It's certainly the case with the Canaanim. It's the case with many factions of the Goyim that currently live in the land of Israel who declare openly that they're at war with the Jewish state and reject it and want to throw it out and kill all the Jews, etc. And some of them have gone to great lengths to do so to whatever degree they're able, sometimes with deadly effect. And so there's plenty of reason to think along those lines. But interestingly, in the example of people like Aner and Mamre, you have this example of how Avram is succeeding in exerting sovereignty over the land of Israel, partly by having allies in the land of Israel who are not part of his tribe. And obviously that's more necessary for Avram, you could say, because he's one man. He's not really a tribe yet. He's not really a nation. So how is he supposed to do things all by himself? But still, I think, the truth is that Avram has a band of men that he rallies together. It says that they got together 318 men. So we don't exactly know how many of those men Avram put up, but the mention of Aner and Mamre and Eshkol as well, that suggests that they somehow are more kind of weighty potentates or something, that they're not just soldiers that Avram kind of brought together, that they're other factions that can kind of put up their own force, and they're combining with Avram. So from that point, you could say, oh, well, if we're going to tell a story about how Avram, with his own merry band, can conquer the whole land and throw out the greater powers, why does he need to have allies? Why can't he just do it himself? If Hashem is going to make a nest anyway, then what does it matter if he does it with 106 soldiers instead of 318 soldiers? Meaning, why does he have to sort of share the credit? And what point is this making? And I think that you could probably make this argument without noticing this. I couldn't help noticing that Amrael Shinar actually has a lot of the same letters as Mamre and Aner, right? So Amraphel has the Aleph Mem Resh of Mamre, and Shinar has the Nun Ein Resh of Aner. And that is maybe pointing out to us what really is going on here in a way that has some kind of point to make about more current events and recent history, which is that the people here in the land who are not part of Am Yisrael have the potential to go different ways, right? They obviously have the potential to be enemies, but even when they aren't necessarily going to be enemies that are simply concerned with their local affairs. They may have to align themselves with external powers, right? That if Amraphel Melech Shinar is sort of the king of Babylon who's attacking in this story, and if there's some sort of Mamre and Aner in him, then what that's saying is that it's not just him who's attacking. He has troops that may be joining him that are coming, in a sense, from the same, groups that Aner and Mamre's troops that are siding with Avram are coming from, right? That there are locals that can join one side or can join the other side. They have the potential to do either thing. I think sometimes when we read Tanakh, we're so focused on the perspective of Am Yisrael living in Eretz Canaan, or living in Eretz Yisrael, after having conquered it from the Canaanim, that we think about how hard it is to be this nation on your own in this little land, and that there's so much pressure to seek alliances with Egypt or with Assyria, or with Aram, or any of these other larger local powers. And then there's this temptation to engage in the idolatry by adopting their gods and all the things that come from that. And we think of that as the existential struggle of Am Yisrael. But what about other little tribes and nations that are here in Eretz Canaan, who, being idolaters anyway, have even less of a disinclination to adopt the gods of other nations? So why not form an alliance with Aram or with Ashur or with Mitzrayim or whatever else if it conveniences you and it helps you against some other enemy that you're more afraid of, right? Anyone who's living in Eretz Canaan or in Eretz Yisrael is going to face the temptation to align with greater powers from outside. And that, I believe, is part of what the Torah may be pointing out to us here, right? That the condition of Avram is one of trying to maintain a kind of sovereignty over this little patch of land when the real forces that are being brought to bear are not local forces. They are the forces of the great empires surrounding Eretz Canaan that are trying to reach in and exert their influence and either conquer or gain some kind of alliance and sort of rule by proxy, etc. And Aner and Mamre are locals who can be friends with Avram and be a bulwark against that external influence. But that same group or tribe, there may be others that, just as easily, or it could be saying, in another world, Aner and Mamre, they're right there along Amraphel Melech Shinar, marching with him, because they could also be, induced to join in an alliance with a foreign power. Now, why is that relevant? I think that's relevant because one of the things this recent war that we've been in the midst of has really underlined very brightly and clearly is that essentially since the creation of the idea, the fantasy of what is called the Palestinian national movement, which is an invention of the early 1960s, right? Since that point and onward, that concept has been used as a tool of imperial interference by Russia and Iran, right? Maybe you could say also some other Arabic-speaking powers that have thrown some money around supporting jihad, etc. But principally, Russia and Iran have been the two major forces. First, during the Soviet era, through the KGB, that was helping the PLO get off the ground and helping the PLO to invent itself and to train, etc. And then, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iranians got more and more involved in supporting guerrilla warfare and asymmetric warfare, attacks of various kinds to murder Jews and kill people in Israel. And obviously that's come to a head in this war where it's been so clear. The war began with an attack from Gaza, but everyone knew that it was not an attack by a completely local contingent of Arabs living in Gaza that just set their own policy and have their own economy and have their own weapons factories. It was an attack by Iran, by proxy, and that was just the beginning of many other kinds of attacks by Iran by proxy from Yemen and from Lebanon and other places as well. And so why is that important? And one should add, by the way, that Iran is not less involved in promoting violence, promoting murder of Jews, promoting warfare against Am Yisrael in Yudan and Shomron, in what's called by our enemies the West Bank, because there has been a concerted effort to create the idea of Palestinian national identity as a tool of imperial warfare against independent Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, first by, as we said, the KGB and the Soviet Union, and then by the Islamic regime in Iran. And I think that the important point to underline here is that what this passage in the Torah is showing us is, you idiots, you complete idiots, because what you did, the state of Israel did with the Oslo Accords, is you accepted and legitimated the idea of unification of this concoction, this Palestinian nation that was invented as a tool of imperial conquest by the KGB and then handed off to the Iranians to be fueled and armed and stoked and all of that. You have legitimated that. You have said there is such a thing as the Palestinian movement for national self-determination, and that you're going to try to solve this problem by dealing directly with its leaders, meaning Arafat and other terrorist thugs trained by the Soviets, etc. Right? And by choosing to do that, you've accepted an imperialistic Trojan horse into your midst, right? This is not about a local self-determination for some local people doing their local stuff. There were, before anyone started talking about such a thing as Palestinians, there were local Arabs who maybe didn't like the fact that there were Jews here so much, murdered them sometimes, were susceptible to calls for jihad, and certainly should not, by default, across the board, have ever been regarded as automatic allies. But there were, let's say, if you go back 100 years, lots of different kinds of Arabs here, some more opposed to Jewish settlement in the land, some less opposed to Jewish settlement in the land. And I think it used to be more obvious to people that there was no reason to make a deal with all of them at once, because they were different clans, they warred with each other, they maybe didn't either linguistically or ethnically or religiously feel completely aligned with each other. They were geographically separated. They were more concerned with local things, with their particular domain, and identify themselves as such, as different peoples living in these different little fragmentary backwaters of the Ottoman Empire. And under that condition, it would have more so been possible to say, okay, who are you? Who are you guys? What do you guys like? Do you guys want to be friends? Great, let's be friends. Let's explain to you what the terms are for being friends with us. What you have to agree is true about the world. Like maybe that Hashem made the world and that he has a brit with the Jewish people and he gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people to rule. And now you can be Gerim Toshavim and we can be very kind and loving to you and we can all be civilized together. But you guys can, have your own autonomy, in certain respects. Right? There's precedent for that, even in a very early period of Tanakh, with the Givonim, for example. Although obviously that's a complicated story, but there's a way for this kind of thing to work in a very positive way, and we'll get some more detail with that in a second. And then we go over somewhere else and we say, okay, who are you guys? Oh, well, here are our principles. What do you think of them? Oh, you think that our principles are totally irreconcilably in conflict with your principles and you want a war? Okay, let's have a war and let's see who wins. And in that situation, I think if you're approaching it that way, then Hashem really helps you win. And that's how the land is won. And that's how you go me'at, bit by bit, pen tirbe alecha chayat hasadeh, and you figure out who can be on your side and who is absolutely irredeemably committed to being on the other side, who has to leave, who has to be defeated violently, who can stay and be friends. And you do that piecemeal bit by bit, and you divide people, you focus on what's different between them, you amplify those differences, you reward those differences where it leads to a better relationship with you, and you can proceed that way, right? But no, that's not what Medinat Yisrael did. Medinat Yisrael said, oh, this idea of Palestinian national self-determination that was invented by nefarious foreign imperial powers that sought to rule this place from the outside or to make war against this place from the outside. This idea is a wonderful idea. We totally agree with and support this idea. We're going to make peace with this idea. We're going to shower money and arms on this idea. And we all know how horribly that went with the Second Intifada, with October 7th and everything in between and everything afterwards. And so in one sense, it's practically very clear what a stupid mistake that was. But I think the point is still that fundamentally what the Torah is underlining is that there is a way of relating to the land of Israel where you say, let's understand that there are imperial powers on the outside, and we always have to figure out how to play them against each other, how not to align with them, how not to adopt their gods, how not to adopt their ideologies. And we have to mistrust them, and we have to assume that they actually are power hungry, that they actually are trying to rule us for the sake of their own interests. And that's true of the Russians, it's true of the Persians, it even is true to a significant extent of the Americans. As much as the Americans are better than the Iranians or the Russians as far as their disposition towards Israel, it still is more complicated than just saying they want what Hashem wants for us. That's not totally the case, right? And they are a giant empire with tremendous wealth and tremendous might. And whenever you aggregate that much wealth and might together, there's a lot that's very corruptible about what it's going for, because it usually is based on some idolatrous notions. So we have to have that attitude towards the outside. But then, as far as who's here with us, the point is we shouldn't be driving the people here into the arms of those empires to join those empires against us, right? That will be a temptation for them. And some of them will do it no matter what. And then we have to fight them, right? But we shouldn't be pouring gasoline on that fire. We shouldn't be agreeing to it in principle and saying, oh, yeah, well, whatever notions these enemy empires that are trying to conquer us are putting forward about some nonsense about national self-determination for disjointed groups of warring clans in our own land that hate each other almost as much as they hate us, that approach is going to be suicidal for us, and it has been now for 40 years or more. But there's a positive aspect to that as well, which is to say, you don't want the people here to join Amrael Shinar. You want them to be Aner and Mam, for them to be your friends. You want them to be allies of yours who are local, who can be your allies because neighbors always can find common ground and aligned interests if they are not sort of driven apart by the problem of idolatry. And I just want to make one little addendum to this video because I fumbled a little bit before. I kept on saying Aner and Mamre, and that Amrael Melech Shinar contains both the letters of Mamre and the letters of Aner, but actually, when you include Melech, you have from Melech the Lamed Kaf, and then the Shin from Shinar, Lamed Kaf and Shin. You already have an Aleph and Amrafel, so you also can spell Eshkol with those letters. So it's really all three of these friends of Avram who are mentioned, Mamre and Eshkol and Aner. And so I think there is a sort of a hint or a suggestion, again, that your friends locally could have, in another version of events, joined enemies from the outside, or running it in reverse, that people here locally who are your enemies, it really may be because, in a sense, they're joining your enemies from the outside. But in another version of events, if you handle things differently, at least some of them might actually have joined you and have been your allies. Ultimately, if the Canaanim around you are committed to false gods, there's nothing to be done about that except to fight them. And Yehoshua had to fight a bunch of Canaanim and had to wipe them out. And so it's not always the case that everyone around you can just be turned into a friend if you approach them with friendship. That's not the way, right? Some of them are just too committed to other things. But there may be ones that bit by bit can be brought to your way of operating. And you need to be looking for those opportunities and creating a structure of incentives that will reward that development. And that means not saying, how can we make a peace deal with, quote unquote, the Palestinians, but instead saying, what about the Sheikhs of Hebron? Maybe the Sheikhs of Hebron don't really care about what happens to these people over here in Shechem who speak Arabic, and these people over here in Jizr al-Zarqa who speak Arabic, and whatever else, right? That there's a bunch of different places in Eretz Yisrael, and instead of assuming that there is a unitary national identity that has to have one thug at the top that we can make a deal with, like Arafat, stupidest thing still perhaps in a very stiff competition that this country maybe has done in its entire history, is bringing Arafat here to try to make him a ruler so that he could be dealt with, right? So that we could get him to sign a piece of paper and then make all our problems go away. That foolishness that stems from a vain hope that it was easy to turn all of our enemies into friends at once. And unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. But what you can do is say, let's find some friends and let's put our resources into putting forward an alternative ideology that says, you're not all one nation, you're different tribes and different clans, and this tribe and clan wants peace with us, and they're good people, and so we'll do that. And then once we do that, we'll be able to show people the difference between the sort of prizes you get if you're our friends and the hell you get if you're our enemies. So I don't know if this thing with the Sheikhs of Hebron is going to work out. I do note that Avram also in his lifetime makes a brit with Abimelech, Melech Plishtim, right? That the Plishtim we know, who later become the enemies of Am Yisrael in the time of Shaul and David, that there's a point where actually Avram lives in Eretz Plishtim for a long time, or near there in Beersheba, and makes a brit with Abimelech, right? That there are times when the same people, maybe a faction of them, or a portion of them, or a version of them in a particular era, can be befriended and at least can have good neighborly relationship. And so I don't know with the Sheikhs of Hebron if this is the real deal, but even if it isn't, that concept is one Medinat Israel needs to embrace, needs to invest significant resources in developing. It needs to put forward a new concept that says, let people with local control decide their own fate, decide if they want peace and friendship and acceptance of the ideological framework of Judaic sovereignty in the land of Israel, and let other people locally make the decision to turn their little town into a terrorist training camp. And then we can start demonstrating by example what difference that makes to your future. And a whole lot of people will learn the right lesson from that. And ultimately, I think with very harsh delineation of that difference, one could actually end up saving a lot of people from war by helping them to make the right decision through the examples that they witness much sooner. But what is never going to work is buying into whole hog the nonsensical and nefarious Trojan horse ideologies of our imperialistic enemies that are trying to rule us from the outside and trying to turn all the people who live right next to us against us. And it may seem like that's already happened and there's no going back. This little example with the Sheikhs of Hebron is a nice little ray of light, at least to suggest that maybe there are opportunities like this we should be looking for if we take the right approach.